want to thank you for joining us for the next installment of this class we've entitled New Testament Background. This will be our final class period, and we've covered a lot of territory. I know it's hard to keep the names and dates and events straight. We've been at it now since really the end of this past September, so about 7 full months of once a week talking about this type of history. We've covered basically from the beginning up until the time of the New Testament in the first century AD. We've traced the story of the Old Covenant people of God primarily from the exile up through, again, the time of Jesus and the apostles. Yes, we traced the story of Abraham from the very beginning, but we did that to just kind of set up the world that the Jews were in once they were allowed to return from Babylonian captivity around 500 BC, give or take a few years there. So went into captivity in 586 for the final time. Then 70 years later, they were released according to the scriptures. So basically from that point on, we've focused pretty heavily on, kind of what happened to the Jews post-exilic period, and then into that intertestamental period that chances are you may have not known a whole lot about. It's been my experience, especially in Churches of Christ, which is the fellowship I'm a part of, that by and large, I never heard much about that time period. And yes, the Bible doesn't record that history, but there are other historians that do. And things that happened in that time period factor in pretty heavily in the world of Jesus and the world of the apostles there in the first century. We've covered historical events, and over the past several lessons, we focused primarily on some groups of people that were influential, again, in the life and ministry of Jesus and the apostles, groups of people that had their origin most likely in that post-exilic intertestamental period. We talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Essenes. Over the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've covered a lot of groups like that. Today we have 3 more that we want to bring in and talk about, and then we'll have some overall discussion about some lessons perhaps we can take away. Once again, I hope it's been profitable for you. Perhaps this hasn't been your cup of tea. I understand that. It's hard to find a study that pleases everyone equally. But I hope there's been some things that you've learned, perhaps even if you thought we could have talked about some other things, maybe focus more on what the scripture said. Again, we're talking about some years where there's no scriptural record. So we've got to do our best to fill in the blanks with other historians. There's one other group in particular among the Jews, or at least related to the Jews in some way, known as the Samaritans. You read of the Samaritans, especially in the life and ministry of Jesus. And if you know your New Testament at all, you know that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along at all, by and large. At the time of Jesus, the Jews and the Samaritans were 2 mutually antagonistic communities. We see an episode of that in Luke chapter 9, verses 52 through 56. Luke chapter 9, verses 52 through 56, and notice the reaction of some of Jesus's disciples to the Samaritans. Picking up in the middle of a thought there in Luke 9:52, it says, "And he," or Jesus, "sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they did not receive him," or the Samaritans did not receive Jesus, "because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. When his," or Jesus's disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" And Jesus turns and rebukes James and John and says, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." They went on to another village. So once again, that's a good set of scriptures just to show how, by and large, these two groups felt about one another. Samaritans were unwilling to accept Jesus in this particular instance, and the Jews, James and John, want to call down fire in heaven to consume them. So that's a snapshot of kind of what was going on. Of course, Jesus didn't feel that way about anyone. Of course, he had to kind of ride the middle between those two groups and especially teach the apostles some things about the extension of their ministry. The Jews, of course, refused to consider the Samaritans as Israelites, mostly because of political and religious reasons. Again, there was a link, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, to the Jews through the Samaritans, but there was enough of a difference they didn't care for each other. The Samaritans accepted the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as the only inspired scriptures, and they offered their sacrifices on Mount Gerizim in Samaria rather than in Jerusalem, where the temple for the Jews was. But these religious differences could have been bridged, since other Judean groups had been permitted to profess similar views without being excommunicated. So there was something about these Samaritans that really rubbed the Jews the wrong way. The primary cause for hostility between the Jews and the Samaritans was the political schism that split Solomon's kingdom in two. And that's a long time before the time of Jesus. You recall Bible history, you had the unified kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. But after Solomon, due to some sin among the people, God divided the kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Centuries later, animosity continued even as the Jews returned from Babylon to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. If you want to take time later, you can read Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. The Samaritans, of course, originated from a mixture of people living in Samaria and others who migrated into the area following the 721 BC conquest of Samaria by Assyria. That was the taking into captivity of the northern kingdom. It predated the Babylonian captivity of Judea, or the southern kingdom, by about 150 years. But the Assyrians left some of the poorest people in the land and brought in other people, and they intermarried and intermixed, and that's the origin of the Samaritans. And again, that's perhaps the primary reason that the Jews didn't care for them at all, the Samaritans being a mixed breed, if you will, in their mind. The Chronicles of the Samaritans stress that they were direct descendants of the tribes of Joseph, of Ephraim and Manasseh, strong rival of the Jews. They occupied the territory in central Palestine, where their own high priest supervised sacrifices offered on Mount Gerizim. You know your Bible geography, Samaria was north of Jerusalem in what would properly be referred to as Judea in those days. Samaritans were often persecuted along with the Jews during the Persian and Greek eras. We studied those eras in this class, but gained more favorable status than the Jews as the Romans gained control of Palestine. The Romans later helped the Samaritans rebuild their temple to reward them for fighting against Jewish zealots. Another sign of Samaritan influence during Christ's time is apparent in the fact that Herod, the king of the Jews, ruled from a Samaritan capital and had a Samaritan as one of his wives. So a lot of intermarriage and political intrigue, as we've seen over and over again in these days, leading up to, again, the life of Jesus. Perhaps the clearest New Testament reference that tells us some things about the Jewish relation to the Samaritans was Jesus's encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. We won't take time right now to read all that chapter. You can perhaps do that later when we're done. But that's a good chapter to just get a feel for what was going on at the time. Jesus, of course, sends the disciples into the town to buy provisions, and that allows him to have this one-on-one encounter with the Samaritan who came to the well to draw water. And Jesus, breaches the conversation, and the Samaritan woman is kind of taken aback. Jewish men didn't, by habit, converse with Samaritans, let alone a Samaritan woman. And of course, that gives rise to and the Samaritan woman brings up, we worship here in this place, and Jews say we ought to worship here, and that prompted some more discussion. But ultimately, of course, by the time Jesus was done, it led to many of the Samaritans coming to faith from her city, as well as the woman as well. So I encourage you to read that chapter once again. So that's a little bit of background to the Samaritans in the time of the New Testament. Let's move on to talk about a couple more groups, not from among the Jews, but among the Greeks of the days of Jesus, and particularly in the time of the apostles. And those are the ones referred to as the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Stoics and the Epicureans. Life has always been full of questions about why things happen the way that they do, questions about the origin of mankind, questions about the existence and nature of God, and questions about the meaning and purpose of life. And people who have considered that over the centuries have been asking these type of questions since the beginning of time. And that gave rise to a field of study known as philosophy. The course of learning known as philosophy attempts to deal with some of these questions. The word philosophy actually comes from a Greek word, which means love of wisdom. Now, the Stoics and the Epicureans were just two of several Greek philosophical groups. We just talk about them because they're mentioned by name in the New Testament. The ancient Greek culture was known for its great philosophical teachers. And even if you didn't know who they were, you've heard of men that went by these names. Men such as Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato were well known for their pursuit of answers to life's greatest questions. These various teachers developed numerous schools of thought or particular methods of contemplating these questions. So these men, these Greek philosophers, would have been in that time frame that we're studying as well. People would listen to these various teachers and decide which one made the most sense to them. These people would then become followers of the ideas of that teacher and will align themselves with others who followed those ideas. So Aristotle had his disciples, Plato and Socrates had their followers as well, and they would get together and debate these things. It's at some point in the process, of course, names would become attached to these groups of followers and attempt to categorize and distinguish them from those who followed other ideas. But we run across these particular groups of Greek philosophers, the Stoics and the Epicureans, in Acts chapter 17, in the ministry of Paul. In Acts 17, as Paul's efforts to teach the gospel brought him to Athens, and of course, Athens was a Greek city, very, very famous for its philosophers. As Paul's efforts to teach the gospel brought him to Athens, we are told that he encountered two of these philosophical groups, the Epicureans and the Stoics. In Acts chapter 17, verses 17 and 18, this is what Luke records. Acts 17, verses 17 and 18. Speaking of Paul, it says, "So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him and said, 'What does this babbler wish to say?' Others said, 'He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities,' because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." So as was Paul's habit, he first in Athens went to the synagogue with the Jews and tried to teach. But he would also spend time, again, being the missionary, if you will, appointed to take the gospel to Gentiles, he would go into the marketplace of the city. And that was a hub of learning. And he ran across these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Well, what do we know from history about either group? The Epicureans were named for the teacher who originated their way of thinking, a philosopher named Epicurus. These people, the Epicureans, believed that the goal of life was happiness through pleasure. They believed in experience rather than reason. They thought that pain and suffering were to be avoided as much as possible, and there was nothing better than to enjoy all of life's greatest pleasures. While it did not begin this way, it's easy to see that this way of thinking soon degenerated into nothing more than crude materialism and sensual indulgence. These people believed in many gods, and they believed that these gods were interested in the same type of self-gratification. So this was a common idea among the pantheon of gods, right? If you were gods, you enjoyed the best of things, and the Epicureans thought that was man's lot as well. As I read through that description there, probably the philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry may have come to your mind, and that was kind of the background of this group. Again, emphasizing experience or perhaps emotion rather than strictly thinking about reason. And of course, that gives rise to this philosophy that, whatever makes you feel good is right. Of course, there's a lot of danger with that philosophy. It's not that the Bible is anti-pleasure at all, but there is a higher calling. And of course, the life of Jesus and the apostles showed that although they were doing what God wanted, it brought pain and sorrow. So anyway, that's a bit of a background there for the Epicureans. Believed in self-gratification and do what makes you happy. The Stoics, on the other hand, were not named for a particular person, but for the painted portico. In the Greek word for porch or portico is stoa, so that's where the Stoics came from. It was in one of these Greek stoas where the founder of their philosophy, a man named Zeno, stood and taught his beliefs in about 280 BC. This line of thinking taught that the entire universe and all the events that take place are the product of order and reason. Emotion and passion, whether pleasant or unpleasant, were to be suppressed in favor of a calm acceptance of whatever fate might direct. So you're already seeing a kind of a stark contrast between the Stoics and the Epicureans, right? Emotion and passion were at the center of what the Epicureans were about. The Stoics, not so much at all. Those were things to be suppressed. People were to live, according to the Stoics, people were to live with an unemotional, self-sufficient attitude. The doctrine promoted dignity, pride, and orderliness. It was directly opposed to the pleasure-seeking Epicurean philosophy. These groups were as different as night and day in their approaches to the great questions of life. And again, as we saw a few minutes ago in Acts 17 there, Paul goes into the marketplace and encounters these two groups in particular, and I'm guessing no doubt there were others around, but these philosophical groups would get in the market, gather in the marketplace of these cities and argue back and forth for their various philosophies. And Paul inserts himself in the middle of that. And of course, if you know Acts 17, he goes on to he tells them in Athens on Mars Hill, I sense you're very religious. Let me tell you about the real God. And of course, you get the response from some of these Epicureans and Stoics. What does this guy, this babbler, wish to say? So some were receptive, some were not. Perhaps mostly just a curiosity in their minds. Reference as well, we get our word Stoic from this background as well, right? A person who is stoic is one, again, that doesn't show a lot of emotion or passion, keeps all those things in check. So that's kind of where our word background of that descriptive term comes from. All right, that kind of brings to a close our study of these various people groups. I hope that's made some sense and gives you a little insight into who Jesus and the apostles were dealing with in their day. All right, as we kind of bring things to a close here in this study, again, we've gone on for quite a while, but when we get together and talk about this in our in-person class, I'm going to give the class there a chance to maybe share some of the lessons they've learned. In this medium, it's pretty hard to do that, but if you've been following along online in these lessons, perhaps you can be thinking about that. I'll suggest 3 or 4 overall lessons from our study that came to my mind as I reflect back on the ground that we've covered. Overall lesson number 1 would be this, and this is something I'm sure you've heard me say several times in this series of lessons, but it's this: an understanding of the Old Testament is vital to correctly interpret the New Testament. I know you've heard me say this, if not in this class, in other classes. The more I study the Bible, the more I'm impressed with this principle, that I think it's nearly impossible to really interpret and understand the New Testament without understanding the background of the Old Testament. That's what we've tried to do. We've spent a lot of time in the Old Testament preparing to talk about the background of the New, because that is the setting. It's God's dealings with the Jewish people that lead to, of course, what God is doing in the New Testament to expand his kingdom to all nations, as he promised to do for Abraham. So I hope that's something that's come through loud and clear as we've gone on. And I would encourage you in your own studies, and maybe you're one that's prompted to say, well, I'm a New Testament Christian. Well, I understand what you mean by that. I'm a New Covenant Christian. Well, that's true. That's what God has been building for. But to understand Jesus and the apostles, again, they over and over again quote from where? The Old Covenant scriptures, what we refer to as the Old Testament, over and over again. They do that because the background of the New Covenant is the old one. Oh, we don't live under that old covenant anymore. That's been taken away in Christ. But that doesn't mean that we can go without that part of our Bible and correctly understand the part that we tend to focus on more than the other. So an understanding of the Old Testament, I believe, is critical to properly understanding the New Testament. Overall lesson number 2 would be this: world powers come and go, kingdoms rise and fall, but the rule of God surpasses each one of them. I hope that's come through very, very clearly as we've studied the history, right? Especially the history following, again, the division of, well, really even going back to the time of Abraham. As we trace that old covenant history, that Old Testament history, what did we see? We talked about a lot of different world powers. Well, there was Egypt. Egypt, if you will, ruled that part of the world in its day. And of course, then came along the Babylonians with Nebuchadnezzar, and they did battle with Egypt. And ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, I guess prior to the Babylonians, you had the Assyrians. So you've got the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and we talked about the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. And then history moved on to talk about Alexander the Great and the Grecian Empire. And they ebbed and they rose and they fell. They came and they went. They ruled the world in their heyday, but ultimately someone came along to overtake them. And that's a lesson, I think, that's hard for even nations in our world today to remember. But history records, and we're called to learn from history. But God's rule, of course, surpasses them all. God taught these nations. God used these nations for various purposes even, but as powerful as any nation got, they still were under the overseeing power and rule of God. Of course, you could look at Daniel chapter 2. The whole book of Daniel emphasizes that with Babylonians as well as the Medes and Persians. So never forget that lesson. And again, God's kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, right? Jesus didn't come to set up a physical kingdom, and that's how many of the Jews of his day mistook what he was trying to do. And frankly, that's the reason many refused to follow Jesus or listen to him and to become disciples of God, because Jesus didn't fit their pattern of a world ruler. They were looking for a military leader to lead them to overcome the Romans, even the mighty Roman Empire that we talked so much about in the later lessons. That no longer exists in the sense that it did in its heyday. So world powers come and go, kingdoms rise and fall, but the rule of God surpasses each one. Overall lesson number 3, and this is something, again, I hope we've emphasized enough that you heard it over and over again, is that the temptations of money and power are universal and inevitably lead to great harm. Temptations of money and power are universal and inevitably lead to great harm. Part of the reasons these world powers came and went, as we just talked about, was the fact that human rulers, in their quest for money and or power, and they usually were included in the same package, some of these movements started out with perhaps some good motives, but as time went on, the temptations increased. They became very, very brutal. And that's what the temptations to money and power will do. That's why Jesus, by the time of his ministry, Jesus lived and ministered in the midst of this world turmoil that went on then, and frankly is still going on today in so many places. The world is still basically a battle between various powers in different parts of the globe. We get information from around the globe these days. The apostles were kind of limited to their own section of the world, but we see it over and over again, and in Jesus's ministry. Perhaps that's why he warned so often, especially among the apostles and his followers, that in his kingdom things were going to be different. If you want to be a leader, you need to be one who serves. Jesus exemplified that. We studied some verses in connection with that. We weren't Jesus's leaders. Followers weren't to lord it over others, as world powers tend to do. So remember that. Learn from that lesson from history. The temptations of money and power, frankly, are universal. It happened then, it happens now, and it always leads to great harm and sin. Finally, lesson number 4, overall lesson, just thinking back of all the territory we've covered, I'm just reminded of the faithfulness of our God over the long haul. The faithfulness of our God over the long haul. And again, we started this study basically in the beginning, and that, biblically speaking, is an untimed verse, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but by the time, we start there, and then we reach the time of Abraham, which again, scholars inevitably date somewhere, perhaps 2500 BC. We come closer to dates that it's easier to nail down historically. But anyway, you've got, let's just say for sake of discussion, Abraham, his story took place around 2500 BC. And now that I say it, I'm trying to remember if that's the date, maybe a little later than that. Anyway, for sake of discussion, we'll just say that's what it is. Basically, from that promise to Abraham, and of course, that was the genesis of at least our understanding of what God was intending to do ultimately through Christ, to right the wrongs that took place in the garden and the fall of humankind. So 2500 BC, clear up to, again, the focus of the aim of our studies to understand the culture of the first century AD. So 2,500 years, 2,500 years, you've got of history that God is using, and we've looked at various facets of that God is using faithfully to accomplish his purposes. And God really continues to do that post Jesus and post the apostolic times. The kingdom of God is still in power. Yes, things are different now under the new covenant, but God has been faithful over time. Of course, God himself being beyond time, humans are locked in that time frame. But yet God, even though from our vantage point, maybe we're thinking, well, why didn't God just snap his fingers, take care of it right away, and save all the history? Well, maybe from a human standpoint, that seems to be wise, but I'll prefer to trust the wisdom of God in taking perhaps the long way to accomplish this. And God, again, has been faithful throughout it all. And that faithfulness of God is, of course, contrasted with the lack of faithfulness on the part of so much of humankind. Left to our own devices, we tear things up rather than build things. And I'm thankful for a God who's been faithful and will continue to be faithful as long as necessary to carry out whatever purposes he has in mind for his creation. All right. Again, perhaps you saw and thought of some other lessons that you've gained over our study. If you got some of those, you might share those in the comments if you'd like to do that, or email me. I'd appreciate to hear from you in that way. Once again, thank you for being part of these lessons. I hope it's made some sense. I hope you've learned some things, maybe heard some things you hadn't heard before that will give you a little more insight into the opportunities you have to study the New Testament and all the lessons that God has for us there. God bless, and I hope you have a great Lord's Day this weekend.